I'm Cherie Garmany Miller, and it is a pleasure to see you all here. And we are going to have an official welcome from the president of Theta Omega Chapter and the AKARAMA Foundation. She has just come into the room from another event, so I will talk slowly until I see that she is ready. So please join me in welcoming our president, Mrs. S.E. Kelly.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be here and to see you and to greet you. I'm just delighted for what we are about to hear and receive this evening. But before we get into that, I would just like for you to help me thank Cherie Garmany Miller. During this administration, during my interim term as in this position, Cherie has served as a community outreach director, and she has been reaching out to the community. And with that, we have this beautiful building that we love so dearly, and she has helped us bring the community into our community service center. And before you, I wanted to just say thank you to her. Would you help me, please? Since our opening, we have had many types of activities. We have had a health fair recently, where many of us got some messages that we wanted to hear and didn't want to hear. We have had some things on financial securities, how to improve our finances, how to save our homes. But tonight, we're going to be fed some intellectual stuff, and that I'm excited about. So thank you for coming, and I'm glad that you're here.
Perhaps I'll move this mic over here. No, that won't work. I'll pull this up like this. Hello, everyone. I'm Bart Schultz, the director of the Civic Knowledge Project at the University of Chicago. And I'm very, very honored to be part of this, the Great Conversations series at AKARAMA on freedom and education. I'd like to begin with a few more words of thanks. Thanks to all of you for braving the elements, coming here for some warm inspiration despite all of that horrible precipitation out there. Really appreciate your turning up. And I'm going to ask you to do it again and again and again. We've got another one coming up November 16th with Ken Warren, December 7th with Danielle S. So the weather couldn't get worse, right? At any rate, please come back. This is an ongoing series, and it's going to be just fantastic. Also, I'd like to offer a heartfelt thanks to everyone who's helped or is actively helping right now with this series. Cherie Garmany Miller, definitely, as Ms. Kelly mentioned, has been instrumental in making all of this happen. Also, Bernard Turner, is he over here? He might be out. There he is. Please take note of Mr. Bernard Turner there, our local Brownsville historian, who has put together, with our Renaissance Society curator, Hamza Walker, the wonderful exhibition on local history out in the classroom there, just east of the main entrance. I want to make sure everyone does stop by over there to enjoy that exhibition. It's a wonderful show on Brownsville history, Southside history, Woodlawn, Washington Park, and so forth. And in fact, I'd like to encourage you to share your thoughts with Bernard Turner on how we could build that exhibition up. It's been a real treat working with the AKArama Foundation. They have this superb educational mission and commitment, and they want to make this part of that. And we want your suggestions on how we can make this more interactive, get more young people involved, more schools involved, make this series something that will live on, that you can really be using out there for educational purposes. So Bernard Turner is the person to talk to about that. After all, the issues of freedom, education, and history, they need our best ongoing efforts. So here's the plan for this evening. After I introduce our distinguished, I should say very distinguished speaker, he will make some introductory remarks for approximately 20 minutes. Then he'll sit down here and I'll interview him for another 20 minutes, asking him some questions to bring out some of the points in his book, his most recent book. And then we'll open it up for question and answer audience discussion. After that, I hope we can all network a bit and visit the aforementioned exhibition just out there, which is also where our distinguished guest will be signing copies of his book, which is available for sale. So hope you will take advantage of this opportunity, hang around, talk for a bit, get a signed book, and so forth. I encourage you to purchase this book. It's a brilliant work from a brilliant man. And here, I'm just going to read you a little blurb from the work in question, Children of Fire, A History of African Americans, by Thomas C. Holt. Thomas C. Holt is the James Westfall Thompson Professor of American and African American History at the University of Chicago, a past president of the American Historical Association. Holt has been a fellow of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is one of those famous MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant Award winners, though he hates including that in the description, but he deserves it. And this is a work that achieves an amazing amount and is well worth your attention. He's the author also of Black Over White, The Problem of Freedom, The Problem of Race in the 21st Century, and the co-author of Beyond Slavery. Tonight, he's going to tell you a bit about how this work bears on our themes of freedom and education. So please give Thomas C. Holt a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much. It's kind of strange to hear Bart wax so eloquently in praise of my accomplishments. He never says that when I see him otherwise. But I want to thank him for that gracious introduction, and as well as to Sherry Miller and to the AKArama Foundation. Am I projecting? Okay. Sounds like I have an echo, but anyway. And I appreciate all of you being here today, especially given the inclement weather. I've become familiar through Bart with the Civic Knowledge Project, from conversations we've had, and have admired what it's attempting to do. I'm also appreciative and grateful for the opportunity to be here to talk a bit about my recent book that Bart mentioned, Children of Fire. Although it's a work of historical scholarship, I had an audience in mind in some ways not unlike this one, or perhaps more precisely, I should say, in the back of my head as I was writing, I had my father in mind, who would fit nicely in this group. Taking what I had to say with a grain of salt, challenging it at times, pushing the boundaries of it, and getting me to restate it in his language. You see, my father was a barber, and anyone familiar with what it can be like in a black barbershop knows that it is, in fact, civic knowledge in practice. In fact, my uncle, my father's brother, was also a barber. And I believe that my first history lessons were actually learned in his shop. His shop was in Brooklyn, New York. My father's was in Southside, Virginia. Or at least I might say that they were probably the first history lessons that I really paid attention to were in his shop, sitting around as he and his customers were debating one thing or another. And having said that, I should add that the other side of my early history education, or at least the stimulation of my interest in history, were the stories about the local history of my town and area that my grandmother told me, my mother's mother. This was when I was a child. I remember listening intently as she recounted what her parents had told her about my community's reaction to the last days of the Civil War. My grandmother lived to be about 90-some years old in the 1960s. I grew up in Danville, Virginia, which prides itself and has a big sign out, or used to have a big sign outside the city limits, on the city limits, proclaiming it to be the last capital of the Confederacy. Because you see, as the Confederate government was pushed out of Richmond by General Grant and was moving south, it was moved, its last stop was Danville, Virginia. It set up shop there for a few weeks before General Lee surrendered at Appomattox, which was about 80 miles or so north of my hometown. Anyway, she was telling me how the locals were reacting to those events as these had been told to her by her parents, who were alive in that, or children in that period. Anyway, all these memories came back to me as I was thinking about what I might say to frame our conversation today. And in the midst of those ruminations, I received an appeal from two of the professional history organizations to which I belong, asking me, along with other historians, to call my senator, in this case, Senator Kirk, about the education legislation that was to be debated in the U.S. Senate Committee on Education yesterday and today, this afternoon, in fact. Senator Kirk sits on that committee. In some ways, I hesitate to call him my senator because I didn't vote for him, but since he's there, he's mine and yours. Well, the problem with this legislation, at least for some historians that they're having with the proposal, is that this new law that's being proposed would set up to give block grants to states and then let them decide what kind of education they wanted to support. I think Bart copied a copy of the letter that he put outside, if you want more detail on it. And while that might be okay in some states, it's feared that in many places that provision might mean that the social sciences, including civics and history, will be de-emphasized in favor of math and higher reading scores, which has tended to happen around the country already, especially as the budget crisis has put a real pressure on school boards, school districts to cut the budget. I would also add my own fear that given the kind of nonsense we've been seeing around the country, the content of history courses, what's being taught, in fact, may well be, in many cases, not what a reputable historian could endorse, and might, in fact, be, in some cases, a few steps backwards. For example, early this year, my home state, Virginia, the state from which I come, I was born, promoted a public history public school textbook that praised the virtues of the Confederacy. Believe it or not. My grandmother would roll over in her grave. And of course, we've heard a lot of similar kinds of nonsense in places like Texas and some other southern states in particular. Anyway, the hope is that our senators can be prevailed upon to modify this legislation to put some controls on what can and can't be done with the money and try to ensure good history teaching in the schools. Now, I should add that in no way is this a campaign intended to contradict the need for better reading and math instruction. Those are clearly fundamental skills. It is only a matter of making the point very strongly that civic education is not just a frill, that it cannot be an afterthought, that it is fundamental to a well-rounded general education and essential for kids preparing for effective citizenship as adults. Such an education involves more than just learning a bunch of facts. It involves mastering the ability to evaluate and analyze the facts, to see if they really are facts. It involves learning to appreciate how one's angle of vision, one's perspective on things, affects how the facts are viewed and understood and can become useful. It is also about understanding that a perspective on things involves locating oneself in time and space, in relation to other peoples, in the nation or the world, and along the long trajectory of time that we call history. Now, it must be said that historically that kind of education that I've just described did not just happen in classrooms or be drawn from books. In our modern age, of course, both books and the classroom are essential to that process. But the task of education is not and has never been exclusively theirs. In any case, knowing that earlier history, I hope, might help us to understand and calibrate that function much better. So what I want to, when asked to give a kind of short introduction for the discussion of my book, it occurred to me that an appropriate introduction on this occasion and given the project that you're engaged in might be to sketch that long history, or at least some precedents for community-centered projects of civic education in the Black community, in Black history. Not only is my own original appreciation of history rooted in such settings, as I've said, in the barbershop, at my grandmother's knee, if you will, but it is part, at least, an inspiration, or part of the inspiration for how I wrote Children of Fire. And by that I mean I tried to frame the book as a history of successive and overlapping generations of folk and to ground it as much as possible in the real-life experience of exemplary individuals. So I thought tonight we might reflect for a moment on just how we learn history, what kind of history we learn, and how historical knowledge can be part of this broader civic knowledge. So what I propose to do is recount some moments, historical moments of such civic engagement. Moments when people gathered and as a collectivity pooled their knowledge of the present and the past to form the basis for present action or deliberation on the issues of their present day. What is perhaps most striking from such a history is how even under the most oppressive, seemingly isolated circumstances, people manage to gather information, analyze it, debate it, communicate it, and oftentimes act on it. In fact, some of my favorite instances of this happened during the American Revolution, during the Revolutionary War. It is often not appreciated that while thousands of slaves and free Black people during the Revolution fought for the American patriots in support of the Revolution, thousands of others, especially in the South, fought with the British or at least took advantage of the British presence to escape their bondage. So if you think about it, some of them were with George Washington at Valley Forge, and some of them were back on his plantation in Virginia trying to get out. The planners, as they always seem to be, or always seem to do, assumed that their slaves didn't know what was going on, despite the fact that they themselves would spend their day ranting and raving about how the British were going to come over and take away their slaves. As it turned out, the slaves knew perfectly well what was going on. In fact, they had often had better information, and they got it sooner than their masters. They spread that information among themselves over incredibly long distances. So while the master was ranting and raving in the living room, or in the dining room, they were in the kitchen packing some food and supplies for the road. Under these circumstances, thousands escaped, some to join the British, but most just to get away. In fact, this was the origin of the earliest African-American settlements in places like Canada, Jamaica, and West Africa, were these escaped slaves, or slaves who escaped during the period of the American Revolution, who took advantage of the American Revolution to escape. But these kinds of events can also tell us a lot about the nature of slavery and slave communities. We know, for example, that while the overwhelming majority of slaves were illiterate, the communities in which they lived often benefited from the literate minority that might be among them, sometimes free, sometimes themselves slaves. People who would read newspapers, pamphlets, or even books to groups of other slaves. We can still see this pattern well into the 20th century, in fact, when Pullman porters, for example, would take the Chicago Defender down to Mississippi, and it would be passed around and read out loud in the barbershops and beauty parlors in places like Hattiesburg or Jackson or Natchez. That was one of the ways, in fact, in which the Great Migration Great Migration North was inspired and organized. So we know that educating oneself through reading and collective discussion has a long history in African American communities, stretching back to the American Revolution down into the 20th century. Along with churches and lodges, it provided one of the very basis for community formation in many cases, for the solidarity of the community, and for collective action. In some cases, the purpose was simple self-improvement, to use one's literacy to learn more about the world, to expand one's world, to become a better person, to make a better community. And we have discussions of groups in which they actually articulate precisely those objectives and goals. Even during slavery, the blacks who were free formed what were called literary societies for that purpose. Much like reading groups today, the groups would select a book that they would all discuss and then gather in someone's house to discuss it. This could be great literature or bestsellers of the day, but we know also that often the book that was selected had a special importance to black people more generally. So, for example, a Chicago resident, Ida Wells Barnett, talks in her autobiography about attending one such meeting of a book club here in Chicago on the South Side during the early 20th century for a discussion of W.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk when it had just come out in 1903. Now, Du Bois's book, of course, was a strong challenge to the political philosophy of Booker T. Washington, and it excited a very important and very heated debate at the time about just what and how black people should respond to the growing Jim Crow society that was building up around them. This was not an activity confined, however, to a relatively well-off and black elite, the people who could buy books and who could spare the time to sit around talking about them. Another of my favorite scenes, in fact, that I came across while I was doing some research on the Reconstruction in South Carolina many years ago, involved a group of black soldiers soldiers who had been recruited into or joined the Union Army during the Civil War. Now, I found records describing how at various moments during pauses in the fighting, these soldiers would attend classes, literacy classes, usually ones that were taught by ministers attached to the units. They would often have a minister who was a part, as they do today, a chaplain, a part of the military unit. Some of whom, in fact, were free blacks from the North who had come, joined the Army, and would be ministering to the soldiers of a given unit. But they were also, in the rest of their time, holding classes to teach them to read and write. Now, one such discussion that I came across, there was a big debate as part of a class on the political issue of the day, which was, and this was close to the end of the war, whether blacks should get the vote even if they could not read or write. That is, whether literacy should be a requirement for enfranchisement. And there were people in this group of soldiers, black soldiers, who were arguing both sides of that proposition. Some of them thought that literacy was, having a literacy requirement for voting was a good idea because it would be an incentive for people to actually get an education, to learn to read and write. If they did that, the reward would be that they would be able to vote. The others, however, and in the end of this conversation that was described by one of the ministers, the group came to the conclusion that that was not such a good idea. As one of them put it, we'd better not wait on education before claiming the vote, because they knew that at that very moment, white Southerners were doing everything that they could to keep blacks from having any kind of political presence. And in fact, were trying to find every device that they could discover to drive them as close to slavery, even though slavery had been abolished, as close to slavery as they could. So they decided that we'd better be able to vote and cast our lot or determine our fate without waiting on literacy. But the point is that this came out of a discussion in which they interacted with each other collectively and figured that out. It's not an accident, I think, that given that kind of activity, that the black veterans, Union veterans, turned out to be some of the most important political figures in the Reconstruction period, not only in terms of holding office, but also in terms of organizing political activity, registering people to vote, getting people to the polls, and organizing to protect them and to protect their communities, to exercise those political rights. I think it has something to do with that prior background. Now, my last example kind of circles back in a way to where I began, and that is the relation between community education and the education of children in public schools. One of the key developments of the Jim Crow era, running from the late 19th century, 1890s or so, into the 1950s, was the exclusion of black children from white schools. But even more so was the absence, in many cases, of public schools for blacks altogether in many parts of especially the rural South. Schools were often not available in rural areas, and if they existed at all, they operated only about 4 months out of the year, so that the children would be available as labor on the cotton or tobacco plantations, or the sugar plantations, as you will. Outside of a few large cities, black high schools were practically unheard of for the most part, down into the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, my own parents were deprived of a high school education for that very reason. There were no black high schools available to them when they were growing up in the 1930s and early 40s in Southside Virginia, where we lived. In fact, they both would later get their high school diplomas via mail order courses in which prepared them to take the GED, which they did successfully. So into my own lifetime, we have the effect of that feature of the Jim Crow Society. But thanks to some small grants from foundations set up by the Julius Rosenwald, a Chicago resident, and in the Sears Roebuck Company, some members of the Rockefeller family, there were some blacks who were able to build schools in some areas of the South, in the rural South. The foundation only provided seed money, however. The people in the community had to organize and supply the actual labor to build the schools and to collect money to pay the teachers, in many cases, when the state wouldn't do it. In fact, if you read Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, he has a very poignant description of his own experience going into rural Tennessee and as a teacher, and of being put up by the various families in that community as part of his compensation and part of their contribution, direct contribution, to the education of their children. Well, the result of this foundation grants by the Rosenwald and Rockefeller foundations was that there was the opportunity in some places to be able to construct schools where the state would refuse to provide them. The process, however, of getting the money involved meetings, discussions, debates, and then organizing the actual work. What is most amazing when one reads the historical record of this is that these incredibly poor communities, people who were really dirt poor with practically nothing, managed to raise fantastic sums of money to ensure that their children and their neighbors' children would get an education. All of these moments, the slave grapevine, the literary societies, the Union soldiers around their campfires, the barbershop and beauty parlors mobilizing for the Great Migration, the poor sharecroppers and tenants that I just described, building schools, discussing and debating how they're going to build schools and raise the funds to build schools for their children. All of these are instances in the long history of the struggle in which people were convinced, as they themselves put it, time and time again, that knowledge is power. And you find that very phrase repeated over and over among all sorts of people in all sorts of situations. For the purposes of our discussion today, one of the forms of knowledge that mattered to them, especially, was the knowledge of their past. One of the things that stood out for me about this history, and I tried, and I hope I succeed in capturing some of it in those moments in the book, was that what I would call a history consciousness of the people that I studied. Time and time again, it became clear that to the people I was studying, their history mattered. For them, the fact that they, their fathers, their mothers, and all the generations that had come before had struggled and overcome great obstacles meant that they could do the same. That history located them in space, in a world that seemed determined to deny them a place in the world, or to push them into an inferior place. That history fixed them in time on what Martin Luther King once referred to as the moral arc of the universe, in a world that seemed determined to exclude them from history altogether, to deny that they even had a history worth studying. But they knew, uneducated or illiterate as they might be, that their history mattered, that it made them who they were, that it might just be the tool with which they would shape their future. And I think that's worth our contemplating. Thank you.
So we'll sit here and talk for a few minutes, but I think I really want to maximize our time for audience discussion. I just want to spare Professor Holt the trouble of reading some of the most brilliant passages from his own work, give you a little flavor of his writing and of just how rich this history is. What strikes me so much about Children of Fire, A History of African Americans, is just how many dimensions of African American history he works into this book. It's not just the story of great men or great women, it's also the story of everyday people, lived life. It's not just the story of the big events or the big political administrations or the wars. It covers a really different timeline, much more of the lived experience across the generations. He didn't mention it directly, but what marks his work, not just this work, but so many of his other previous books, is a very keen sense of economic history, the shifting, the changes in the economic institutions that have determined the life trajectories of the peoples he's writing about. All of those things figure in this book. It's very hard to get a history that covers so many different methodologies, approaches, experiences, and topics. I'm going to start maybe with a somewhat more abstract angle here, and then maybe we'll bring it down to a few more local and personal questions. Let me share this passage. This is from the end of his previous work, The Problem of Race in the 21st Century. And it gives you a sense of the sweep of the project that I think he picked up in Children of Fire. It says, certainly the history of African Americans contains some complex and difficult truths. Historically, to be African American has been to live on the razor's edge of ambiguity and seeming indeterminacy. The homespun proverbs abound: to make bricks without straw, to make a way out of no way. Only our singers, our poets, and a few of our intellectuals have had the wit to name it. Du Bois called it a double consciousness. Ralph Ellison hailed the harsh discipline of African American cultural life. More often an unnamed yet lived experience, it is a timeless resource embedded in our personal histories and memories. From that lived experience come, to borrow Toni Morrison's haunting phrase, stories to grow on, stories for our children to seize and claim as their own, stories of a people who pulled something from deep within themselves that little in their visible history and circumstance would have seemed to warrant. He follows through on that history big time with this work, trying to break a lot of the fixed categories that you might bring to a history of this sort. So I wonder if the first question could be, could you tell us a little bit more about your methodology? What persuaded you that intergenerational lived experience was breaking up the own category, the categories you used to bring to your historical work?
Am I heard? Okay. Well, actually, I talk about that a bit in the preface to the book. It came to me actually at the time that I was about 3 years into the project, and my father passed away. He's one of the people the book is dedicated to. And he had, many years before, asked me to do the eulogy, or do part of the eulogy at his funeral, which I had agreed to. I mean, this has been many years before he passed. In the process of doing that, I reflected on his life and his life in relation to my own. And it was out of that, I mean, my father was born in 1917, died in 2000, had lived through, he had been born in the rural Virginia on a tobacco farm, had fought in the Pacific in the Army, in a segregated Army. So he had many experiences, but he lived through a period in which really cut across some of the experiences of African Americans more generally that we tend to separate. I mean, in other words, he had lived through a period in which sharecropping was the dominant form of employment for many people in the South, due to a period in which that disappeared in the 1950s. He had lived through a period of the intense Jim Crow regime. I mentioned that somewhat about the education earlier. And there are many other stories connected to that. But through the civil rights movement, which Danville, my hometown, would have been one of the hotspots of the civil rights movement. And so reflecting on that, to make a long story short, I thought that, well, if one applied that to the longer history and tried to think not in terms of the kind of divisions that historians usually use to mark off their chapters and to mark off the chronology, but think of it in terms of generations, then you might see that history differently, because that lived experience informed his life in a way that, the typical representation of that history would not capture. And when I thought about that and looked and applied that from my father's experience to, say, a person like Frederick Douglass, who was born in slavery, lived to be a major figure in the abolitionist movement, continued in the post-Civil War period to be a major leader, recognized and revered, actually, by many people, white and black, in this country, but to die in the 1890s at the very moment in which, the Jim Crow regime, segregation, Plessy, just before Plessy versus Ferguson, that's a very different perspective on a life and on a history that if one sort of chopped it up into its particular segments. And it explains a lot about Douglass and his responses and so forth.
So you read this book and it feels like lived experience. You can see, these ancestral conversations, and it's not like picking up the encyclopedia, chapter 2, World War II. And to get that feel, I can't tell you how much historians admire the originality of this kind of approach, trying to get so many elements in there. Since you mentioned Frederick Douglass, and I think maybe we should take off on that brilliant man for a moment. He figures in this book. There's certainly a great deal of attention paid to these phenomenal figures, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, King, and others. And in this case, the chapter on Frederick Douglass really brings things home right here to Chicago, to some of the stuff featured in Bernard Turner's exhibition out there, having to do with the famous 1893 Columbian Exposition, which of course happened just here on the south side, Jackson Park, and then across the Midway. Frederick Douglass made a famous appearance at that, and it was a rather controversial event. A couple quick passages from this book. Black people figured prominently in exhibits intended to contrast modern civilization with humankind's primitive origins. Although the sovereign nations of Haiti and Liberia, the world's only black republics, were found in dignified pavilions, the fair chose to represent what was taken to be the normative state of African-descended peoples by an ostensible replica of a Dahomean village located on the Midway on the periphery of the fairgrounds center. The Midway was a rather different affair from the main pavilions in the so-called White City. And as you go on to note, Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells came up with an alternative idea. This is an alternative idea concerning the representation of blacks in the World's Fair in the White City that had the virtue of sustaining a black presence at the fair, but couching it in protest. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. What Bart is referring to is that, you had the Great Chicago Fair here, one of the many international fairs that were pretty common in that period, well into the 20th century, where you would show the progress of civilization, you would show heavily oriented toward technology and, the telegraph, things like that had been, and steam engines and so forth. And all of that in what was called the White City, which is lit with electric lights, which is another innovation, showing progress. While on the Midway here, you had other smaller exhibits that were really more for a carnivalesque kind of experience, showing, there was an African village that was supposed to be representing how Africans lived, and it was a put-up job, of course, but, there was an Indian village, there were belly dancers, there were, all kinds of things of that sort. And so, but there was because the fair was organized through various states that would, plan these exhibits, blacks who were mostly in the South, there was still about 90% of blacks still lived in the South. Those states did not provide any exhibit for blacks. I mean, a few exhibits like Hampton Institute had an exhibit. There were some exhibits through New York State's exhibit, New York State's auspices. But for the most part, blacks were not in the white city, which represented civilization, progress, order. They were, however, represented by the Africans on the Midway, which was disorder, lack of civilization, primitivity, and so forth. And this, of course, infuriated people like Frederick Douglass, Ida Wells Barnett, and countless others. The black newspapers were calling for a boycott of the fair. Don't go there at all. They're insulting to us. Douglass and Ida Wells Barnett came up with the idea, well, we'll be there, but we'll be there protesting. We will put together a pamphlet, and the pamphlet will detail statistics and all kinds of factual information about just how much progress blacks have made since emancipation. Emancipation was in 1865, and now 1893, only about 30-some years, a generation, has passed, and yet we have bank accounts, we have property ownership, we have education, we have institutions like Hampton and Tuskegee and others, and Howard. We have doctors. In fact, right here in Chicago, during that same period, a doctor performed an operation on the human heart, one of the first, right, at Providence Hospital. There were people like George Washington Carver, who was, then he later would become famous for his innovations with the peanut and with agricultural chemistry. Then he was actually at the fair exhibiting one of his paintings that and he won a prize for it, of a naturalistic a plant. People like Paul Laurence Dunbar, who's just beginning to emerge and hadn't actually published his first volume of poetry, who was at the fair working with Douglass, and so forth and so on. Douglass himself was at the fair not by virtue of anything having to do with America, but because he had been a consul to Haiti. He had been a diplomat in Haiti previously, and the Haitian government was very appreciative, appreciated him, honored him, and they asked him to run their pavilion. So he's there as part of a foreign pavilion. So anyway, that's the context. And the context was that we will show the world and we will publish it in English, Spanish, French, and put it in the hands of everybody who comes to the fair, showing you that America is not what it claims to be. Because the fair was supposed to be, a sort of exhibition of how the progress of America. And they were going to say, well, maybe you've got the electric light, but in terms of your treatment of blacks, you are still very much retarded. And so they did, except they didn't get enough money to publish the whole pamphlet in these many languages. They just did the preface or the introduction of it. And as part of the fair, too, there were these events in which different groups had a day. The Poles, the Germans, whatever. And so there was supposed to be one for, black Americans. And there was a lot of debate in the black community about whether they should participate in that because, they're simply going to poke fun at us. They're going to use it to ridicule us, to insult us. Douglass, including Ida Wells Barnett, she very much opposed it. But Douglass said, well, it's a chance to show that there are people like Will Marion Cook, who's a great composer of classical music. We have poets, we have orators, and we can show that at this event, which they did. And Douglass himself made, as was his wont, a rousing speech condemning the onset of Jim Crow and lynching. Remember that 1892, when the fair was opened, was the year that you had the highest number of blacks lynched ever in this country. So that contrast between what was supposed to be progress and what was, in fact, social regression in the view of many blacks was on display.
So, I mean, protest as education. There's no question about it. And I've got to add here, some of you may realize, how long did it take for some historical marker to go up to commemorate Frederick Douglass's appearance at the World's Columbian Exposition? Only a little more than a century, right? There's a marker over there, just went up a couple of years ago, thanks to the Jackson Park Advisory Council. Urge you to go and take a look at it. It's a nice tribute, but a little overdue. Maybe moving to the personal and your own activism that has shaped you so profoundly, your sense of knowledge as power earned through protest. You've talked a lot about your father, but what about your formative experiences? I know you spent a lot of time as a civil rights organizer in the South. Is that what led you to become the historian?
Not really. In fact, it pointed me in the opposite direction. I was interested in history as a subject. I was not ever thinking that I would be a historian until quite late in life. Well, in part, it was, I guess, my circumstances. I went to school at Howard University in Washington, D.C., which was a place that people like Stokely Carmichael and Cortland Cox and a whole number of other people, especially people associated with SNCC, were students who were my classmates. And there were demonstrations that were basically based at Howard that, demonstrating against segregated restaurants and so forth in Maryland, Maryland was essentially, a Jim Crow state, even though it's above the Mason-Dixon, north of Washington. Washington itself was a pretty segregated town when I was there and as a student. Danville, as I mentioned, was one of the sites of the early movement, my hometown, and so I was drawn into the movement by that. But actually, I guess to connect to your theme about education and activism, the roots, probably the seeds are earlier than that. I had a high school teacher who, named Mr. Hinnett, who actually they had a Fulbright to go to Nigeria, and while he was there, he wrote me letters about it, and sort of was one of my education about the world, not in the classroom, but through that medium. And I recall very distinctly that he, on two occasions, one, he took us to, as part of our civics, you had civics as a course in those days, I don't know if you still do or not, but he took us, our civics class, over to the courthouse. And the courthouse was just to see a trial, an ordinary trial. And the courthouse was, in those days, segregated. Blacks sat on one side, whites sat on the other. They swore on a different Bible. And so those of us who had never seen or been inside a courthouse who were learning this or seeing this for the first time. I remember getting up, in fact, at one point and going on the other side, the white side, and was then asked by the bailiff to get my butt back over to where I belonged, which I did. I didn't want to go to jail then. And on another occasion, he took us to see one of the early civil rights cases. This one, a suit against the local library. Because, again, the libraries were segregated. The big library in town that had most of the books was for whites, and the small library, about the half size of this room, was for the colored library. And so we actually went to see a federal trial in which this was being discussed. So those were some of the earliest experiences where the system that I'd grown up in, was coming of age in, was being challenged. And the context actually for that exposure was through my high school teacher.
The power of high school teachers, right? That is a good point for us to segue into some general audience discussion. We have a lot of students here, a lot of teachers. And at this point, I get to stand up and go pass the mic around to people. I'd like to thank some of the groups here. We've got the Odyssey Project students and teachers and administrators. Thanks to them. This is a wonderful. If you don't know what the Odyssey Project is, find out. Amy Thomas Elder and some of these people over here will be glad to tell you all about it. They are meeting here at AKArama twice a week, doing a year-long course in the humanities for adult learners. And it's a wonderful project, a wonderful form of alternative education here, providing something that we don't get through formal institutions the way we should. We've got a group here from college prep, and we have, of course, some of our Great Conversations regulars who usually join us at the downtown Gleacher Center, but have come down here, and many of the AKArama people. So this is a wonderful group, and I'm sure you've got a lot to say. Please say it.
Hello, my name is Honey Harris. I'm with the Odyssey program, and my question is, blacks were really about education in the past. What has happened? Like, why are we not as passionate about education now?
Well, I guess that's a $64,000 question. Just to give some historical perspective on it, I think people value education if they see the value of it, if they see it. Some of the people I was talking about historically, I mean, people who you would think are isolated, they're illiterate, and people coming out of slavery, for example. And one of the fantastic things that happened in the 1860s, 70s, was that schools were being opened up by missionaries, black and white missionaries, some of them associated with, religious organizations that came to the South. And they were just overwhelmed with people coming. I mean, people of all ages coming to their schools. Move forward several decades into the 20th century, and you have a disconnect. I mean, I should go back. They saw education, and they articulated it this way. They said it, as directly related to, the quality of their lives. To, in this case, them being able to make their freedom real, and whether that meant being able to vote, or whether that meant being able to protect yourself when most of them were still sharecroppers and tenants, when your landlord, the planter, says that, well, you only get this amount of money rather than that amount of money, and if you're illiterate, you have no way of, checking up on him, and so you find instances where somebody in the family, has a child, or often the wife of, that sharecropper has some ability to, to counter that. So they can see it paying off in very specific ways. I suspect, and this is a hypothesis, that you get into the 20th century, we begin to see that break down a bit. There's a book on Chicago by James Grossman called Land of Hope, about the migration to Chicago. In one of his chapters, he talks about, education in schools. And you can begin to see there some loss of faith this is in the 1920s, loss of faith in the power of education, because it doesn't map on to people being able, like those earlier generations, to use the education to, to protect themselves, to advance their interests, to get ahead, or just for their own satisfaction, because it had been something they had been deprived, it had been illegal to to teach slaves, for example. So it doesn't have that valence anymore. It doesn't have that sense for a younger generation that's coming up, especially when the schools are inferior, including in the North, including in Chicago, and when the education doesn't map onto the kind of life they would like to live. So I think that's part of the change historically. Now, of course, one could, as in anything, there's a much more fine and detailed kind of analysis one can make of what's wrong with our schools and our schooling.
High school teacher.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Joshua, and I'm representing Urban Prep. We actually have 3 students here with me today. So we've been talking about the concept of community. That's been our unit right now in our class. And so we've been talking through it, trying to define it as just very simply something that people have in common. Community is a group of people who interact and share something in common. And so when we talk about the African American community, of course, obviously you have to take into account the history of the African American community as something which bonds them together, having this common experience. That's actually why we came here today, to hear a little bit more about that history. But the question which was kind of brought up here, talking with the students, is that although there is this really strong bond of history, today, I think this was Mr. Kerr actually who brought it up, there's a great diversity now, even more than before, of the African American experience. What does that mean? And so I guess what we're trying to ask is, how strong can the African community remain when you have, on one side, you do have a history, a few hundred years of just very strong, very similar experience, but now with a new experience today, which will become the history of the future, which is very different and which is diversifying. So how strong, is the community? I guess that is our question.
Well, I would maybe turn the question a little bit and ask, well, what makes for the strength of a community? And I would first of all say, one has to be careful not to romanticize the communities of the past. The African American community has always been diverse. And you're right that what knits a community together is the perception of common interests, common experience, and bonds. What that means, though, is not necessarily that everybody's the same, but rather that they perceive those parts, that are, they focus on those parts that are the same. An obvious factor in the solidarity of black communities has been, racial oppression. And whether that's been in terms of segregation or Jim Crow or slavery or, whatever. Now, today, it's often, in relation to your question, brought up that, well, there's an economic differentiation within the black community now. People actually, have different material resources available to them, different lifestyles, different resources. I'm a little bit, that's well taken, but I'm a little bit suspicious of it because, again, that's always been true. I mean, maybe not to the same degree as today, but there's always been a differentiation within economically, education. I mean, even some of the things that I mentioned, about the literate slave who would read to the illiterate slaves. So I guess the question is, and I think it's overstated even in the notion of a fragmentation of community today, because it's a partial truth, certainly. But if you look at, say, voting patterns, polls, there's a tremendous, solidarity, if you will, in terms of the political, ideological, and other positions within the black community, especially compared to the majority community, even to this day, despite the rise of a black middle class and the fact that people are at least to some degree able to live outside of the black community, despite the fact that some of the key institutions that built communities and were important to its formation, like churches and various other kinds of private social institutions, schools themselves, whether they're colleges or your local school, built up an allegiance and a sense of commonality and connection, despite differences of economics and so forth. So that despite all of that, you still have a black community that in many respects, if you look at the vote at the next presidential election or whatever, you're going to find a much greater solidarity than previously. So that's a rambling answer. That is both a bit overstated in terms of the comparison, and then if you break it down, it's a matter really of whether people are focused on those elements that bring them together as opposed to those elements that are differentiate them.
Yes, my question, Kenneth Hill, my question is, given that more African Americans are graduating from college, more African American males and females are going to college, 80% of all African American males by 25 have a GED or high school diploma. Given that these are facts, from your viewpoint, what kinds of things should be done to acknowledge what you were saying before about that dedication to education that still exists, even though there's a perception that it's not, but the facts do not support the perception?
Well, I'm trying to think, there is the question of whether rates of graduation or of earning, degrees maps onto, or its relationship to this thirst for knowledge and for, self-education. And I raise that as a question, not as an assertion. The kind of stories that I just told about these literary societies, about these other moments in which, historically, people were driven not by the credentialing of an education or of achievement, but rather by the power, as I say, often the phrase was knowledge is power, the power of the knowledge itself for them to enable them to shape their lives and shape their future. That is the tradition. So what some people may be referring to is the lessening of that tradition, as opposed to that you have a much more educated in terms of, or credentially educated population. So that you're right, absolutely. The numbers of blacks, I referred to 1930s, there were no black high schools. So, only a very few people had a high school diploma. And that, it may seem a long time ago, but in historical terms, that's a big turnaround to now have, very unusual for someone not to have a high school diploma. Although I must say that, there is a worrying signs of, the dropout rate and so forth, of that creeping back up again. For a while back in the 80s, 90s, it was, the statistics I saw, the Urban League puts out, it was very high, and now it's come down a bit. So that may be a worrying sign in terms of the future. But nonetheless, historically speaking, we are the most educated generation of black folk, ever. But the uses to which we put the education, our commitments to, not simply schooling, but to, to knowledge. It may be, there's a question there whether that's at its peak at this time, as opposed to the past.
Hi, my name is Lindsay. I'm involved with the Odyssey Project. One of my favorite things to tell people in a tone of despair, is that the U.S. Department of Education's mission statement is purely in terms of, I think it's something like educating people to participate in a global economy. There's not even a word about citizenship. I was just wondering if you might say what kind of argument you would make to the government about sort of generally for all Americans the argument for needing to know history in order to have a functional citizenry.
Probably look at the audiences in the presidential debates. Might be a start. I mean, the interesting thing, of course, is that the idea of universal, relatively universal public education is, again, in historical terms, relatively, recent. That is, early 19th century in this country. And even then, it was confined to places like Massachusetts and Illinois, not to, Mississippi or Georgia. So it's been a slow growth. But the original idea was, in fact, articulated in terms of citizenship, in terms of being able to, that the democracy required people to be, able to participate and required knowledge. And so where this turn comes to, as you say, that is mostly articulated now in terms of a global competition and economic competencies, is itself an interesting empirical question. I suspect that that's an easier sell in terms of getting people to support. You need tax dollars to pay for education. And so if, you do a kind of cost-benefit analysis that if you put this much money in, you get this much money back, and we all are enriched. Whereas enrichment in terms of understanding something about the world and being able to make logical political decisions in your own, in your own self-interest, is a harder sell. In terms of explaining it. In terms of what one might say to the Department of Education, I suspect they already know that. And so it's really not a matter of their being convinced as showing the political, viability of that position. That's my guess anyway. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm self-interested because that's what I do. But it seems to me that so often, again, just if one looks at political debates and discussion, so much of it turns on an interpretation of the past. And often it's not simply people's factual knowledge of the past, which itself could be deficient, but also just how to evaluate, whether a decision to go to war, for example, in terms of references to the past in order to justify or to argue against. A decision about the meaning of the New Deal for our own discussion now of our economic situation and what might be done. So you could, enumerate any number of historical precedents that are used to justify or not a current decision today. And so being informed about that history seems to me, which is not to say that there's one history or entire agreement, but at least to be informed would, it seemed to me, elevate that discussion, and you have a better chance of getting it right.
I forgot to mention another group represented here, Occupy Chicago. Just in case you haven't heard of Occupy Chicago, and you've been living on Mars or something. David here, will you please explain what that is and how that connects to this talk?
Thank you. My name is David Orlikoff. Occupy Chicago is a spinoff of Occupy Wall Street. We've been occupying LaSalle and Jackson, the financial sector, at the Fed Reserve Bank, Board of Trade, and Bank of America we're on like day 26. But it's related to Occupy Wall Street. Essentially, we're fighting for a democracy in America because our government doesn't work for the people and it's totally controlled by big business and corporations. I was interested by the last question and the answers, and as far as the mission statement of education being to compete in a global economy. I think pretty clearly, if you're familiar with statistics just in Chicago for employment for African Americans, it's a staggeringly low, or the unemployment is staggeringly high. And obviously, overall unemployment is very high in this country. I think it's clear that that form of education, that working for the test and just the math and the reading, does not prepare us for a global economy. And I think that a civic understanding, so that you understand the forces behind the economy and actually who's at play in the world, seems more important to having a functioning economy, because you don't just need to be educated yourself you need to have a job there for you. And if they're all outsourced, or if all of the investment money is only going into speculative markets with no real value and they're not producing growth in businesses with jobs, how can you get a job? How can you work? There can be more today, more African Americans graduating from college, but we have people protesting of all races and all generations, and they're coming out of school and they're feeling like they're trapped in debt slavery. We have, white kids now who feel like they're indentured servants because they're coming out of college with no job and hundreds of $1,000s, well, $75,000 or more in debt. So, what is the real importance of civic learning? Isn't it even more important than that formal education, even in terms of economic power and everything else?
Well, I think in some ways, going back to my response to the earlier question, the importance of civic education is to appreciate precisely some of the things you've described. If one understands again, and relates to some of the other questions as well, one understands the value of education, then perhaps one would be willing to pay for it. And one of the things that we've had for decades in this country is the unwillingness of people to, in fact, support a public education system. This goes back to at least the 1960s, 70s, with various moves to reduce so-called tax revotes, refusals. I was living in Michigan at a time in which a bond issue to support the public schools was voted down by citizens because they didn't see it as in their interest. So part of the civic education is to, I think, to get people to understand a commonality of interest, even if you are not directly, if you don't have a child in school, but it's still important to have public schools, for example. And so it's important that you have a college-educated generation. And so it's worth, investing so that kids are not having to take out loans that, indenture them after graduation if we, pay for education. I mean, many other of our peers, Western, countries, in fact, do pay for education. That is higher education. So it's not as if we're inventing, the wheel. But it goes back again to education in the broader sense of, of a collectivity, that we are a collectivity and have a common interest, which may not track differently than our own personal interests. So in broad terms, that would be, the kind of argument I think one might make.
You want to follow up on that?
Hi again, I'm Honey. I do have a question. How do we get young people enthused by education? Like I said, I'm part of the Odyssey program, and majority of us are over the age of 25, and we're learning great things about Socrates, art, everything. But thing is, though, I have a nephew. He's a freshman at Robert Morris. He's going to graphic arts, but he wanted nothing else to do with any other education. And I felt like he was missing out. He just wants to do what he wants to go into. So how do we get the young people to want to learn about art history, even though it may not have anything to do with their life's ambition, but what happens, like this Sunday, I decided instead of looking at Desperate Housewives, I looked at Blacks in Latin America, because that's interesting. That's always been me, but how do we get kids to not want to play video game and look at something like that? So I'm talking about the young people. How do we get them excited about education?
Well, I can speak not as a teacher, but as a parent, and I can't get my 12-year-old to have a broad interest in education beyond what the homework I force her to do. So I'm not exactly qualified to provide you an answer to that. I don't know. And again, I think there's maybe a danger of romanticizing the past, which sometimes we do, that people in the previous generation more generally had that kind of broad interest. I mean, some of my classmates when I went to school would not have had that interest, that broad interest as well. For those who may be susceptible to it, certainly exposure in various ways or various techniques. Certainly a lot of things I'm interested in came about because I've had some fantastic teachers, who opened up a world for me. And often, as I say, outside of school. I mean, so they weren't necessarily in classrooms that it happened. But beyond that, I have no magic formula for it. And if I find it, I will apply it to my 12-year-old.
Yes, I wanted to follow up too. What you pointed out was the importance of education historically. I made a statement that 80% of African American males by 25 have a high school diploma or a GED. But 50% of them drop out. So something about what you were talking about, I believe, result in that 30% going on back to school. And why can't we have a conversation about that?
Well, I'm all in favor of the conversation about that. No, I get your point. I mean, I think, and it's worth recognizing and building on that in various ways that we can. I don't have any particular answers for that, but it suggests maybe that having, and think about, I described the experience of my own parents who didn't get a high school education because there weren't any, but then themselves, made their way back. And I mentioned them, they were doing courses by mail, which was available, correspondence courses, but they also had, summer schools for adults for a period there, I recall, them going off after a full day's work, taking classes at the local high school. Which then was a black high school that was available for adults. So in the past, people have talked about lifelong learning as a model, as opposed to simply thinking schooling is for kids from 5 to 18 or something, but rather that one can always come back and recoup what you did not have before. People who dropped out, people who, for various reasons did not, go straight through. So institutionally, in terms of what one can do, and it goes back to the political will and to expend the money for it, it might be to have that kind of education system so that someone who's disinterested, as the young lady was saying earlier, but whose interest is rekindled once they're out in the world of working, then see, okay, maybe I should have paid attention to that math or that reading or that history or that art course, and have the opportunity to do it. Also, obviously kids who, one of the big problems, kids who get pregnant, young women, and then drop out, but then can come back. So that might be, one avenue at least of addressing the kind of problems that have been raised. But they all go back to a political will and to make those kind of expenditures, set up those kind of institutions.
I should add that I think both AKArama and one of our co-sponsors, the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Education, are deeply committed to lifelong learning. That's really where the Great Conversations series is located. And in fact, at the University of Chicago, you can join the system before you're born at the hospital and never leave it, even in the afterlife. So we're committed to lifelong learning and beyond. Bert, do you have a question?
I hope I'm not the last one. Hi, I'm Bert Schultz. I'm very related to Bart, but only intellectually. And that would be a compliment to Bart. I guess my question is this. For some of us old dogs who have been around and done a whole bunch of things and are just learning about history perhaps for the first time, because as a high school student, I couldn't care less about history. I was more interested in building cars, racing cars, electronics, girls, not women, but girls, doing all those kinds of things. So what suggestions and thoughts might you give me so I can proceed with the rest of my life and continue my education?
Well,
Buy the book.
my agent here. Well, I mean, the one thing about it is, at this point, you know, one is free to do what you want to do. I mean, you don't have to have institutional, certainly for history, you don't have to have institutions to guide you. Although there, I guess, exist courses and so forth that one can take. I mean, history is one of those non-specialized, you know, disciplines in which one can dip into and simply read to have the, I guess, the simplest answer. But, you know, to the extent that the, you know, lifelong learning exists, you know, and available, then that's another way. So, I mean, I think that's what I would suggest. Yes, right. That it's available to you in a way that, say, picking up calculus at this stage may be a little more difficult, you see.
Hi, I'm Lyndon Kerr. I was just, can I please sit down? I was just wondering where, like, the personality of the race has changed. Like, I hear so much in African American history or whatever, hundreds of years ago, we were all unified as a people trying to get out of slavery. And then even back in the 60s, we started riots and protests and whatnot. But then where did the personality change from we want freedom to let's sling some crack? And also, I mean, I can sort of tell why it's staying like that. I just want to know why it's there. It's staying like that because there really isn't a lot of integration. If you notice, through this entire block, the majority are people of our color, but why? Where did the gumption go, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I'll begin with what I said earlier, that, you know, be careful about those kind of comparisons because, you know, people weren't necessarily all unified and, you know, in fact, one of the things we do in history is look at all the debates that people were having. But it may be, though, that they were unified on the most important things, which was their relationship to the larger society, the kinds of policies that they would support. And again, I think that's still true to a large extent. In terms of the kind of split, I guess you're referring to, that's been much discussed, where one of the things coming out of the civil rights movement was, you know, many people getting ahead and the growth of a middle class. At the same time, you had a worsening of conditions for a large, sectors of the black population. That, I think, one has to look not so much to, which is not to let people off the hook, but not so much to what happened in terms of people's personality or interest or incentive and so forth, but at much more readily available to explain what happened are changes in the larger economy, society, and politics. About the same time as the civil rights movement was succeeding in changing laws in the 1960s was a time in which the employment, the industries that blacks had come to places like Chicago to earn their livelihood were either moving to non-unionized places in the South or out of the country altogether. Or they were moving simply outside areas in which people could get to them for work. So a place like Philadelphia that had a U.S. steel plant in Philadelphia during the period of the Great Migration and into the late 50s was by, a decade or so later, had moved out into Bucks County, where blacks could not get to those jobs. So much more simple, structural. In some cases, it seems impersonal, but they're part of a transformation of the society that people get caught up in. That's much more a direct explanation for what you're looking for than that somehow people themselves failed. Which is not to say that some people didn't fail, but that's not the first place to look for the explanation of what happened. And therefore, the solution to it is not that there be some transformation in the personalities of black folk, but rather the more immediate solution is that the conditions in which they find themselves be changed. And that can be dealt with by political and economic decisions that we can make. Okay?
We're about to adjourn over to Bernard's exhibition. A couple more things. I wonder if I could persuade you to do just a little reading, the tail end of this work, The Problem of Race in the 21st Century. What then can I tell my daughter? Stick close to the mic here, or I
Okay.
can hold it up.
Where do you want me to read from?
I'll hold it up for you.
No. I feel like I'm going to eat it.
That last bit. Since you've already brought
Yeah.
Johnny into the conversation. Our daughters both go to the lab school.
Yeah.
And that's another story.
Yeah, this was written when she was about 2 years old. What then can I tell my daughter if the problem of the 21st century is still the color line? Like many who have gone before you, you must struggle against injustice with all your might. You must refuse to be racialized or to racialize others. But at the same time, you must also live as if the world were otherwise. You must reach out and claim it as your own. I know that is a lot to ask. It will certainly require difficult heroism and a subtle resistance, as well as exposure to the risk of being misunderstood by your peers and elders. But perhaps, just perhaps, when enough people do as you do, racism will indeed have no future.
A big hand for Thomas C. Holt. And last word here from our wonderful, wonderful representative from the AKArama Foundation, Cherie Garmany-Miller.
Okay, thank you. This is not the last word. It was just that I said, is there some way you can get me on the agenda? So I have the pleasure of thanking you for coming out this evening, because once we move to the exhibit, you will hopefully participate in the Emil Jones room, and then we will conclude the evening entirely. I would, before we leave this room, however, like to acknowledge all of the members of the AKArama Foundation who have been here tonight doing various things to make this, hopefully, what was for you a very pleasant experience, and will bring you back in November. We may not be the writers of history, but we certainly want to be participants in ensuring that history is an accurate depiction. So for us, these types of engagements are very, very important. So please join me in acknowledging all of the members of the AKArama Foundation who are in the room. Would you please stand and be recognized? Again, I want to thank you for coming out, and I will see you because I have my copy of the book, and I would hope to get it signed, especially since my mother's maiden name is Johnson. Now, okay, that's a little inside joke, but if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. So, go get the book and enjoy the exhibit. Thank you.